So now we are up to chapter 30. We've moved through quite a bit, and you're going to see in this section, you will see certain connections if you follow, if you think back to what we've kind of learned in earlier chapters. And if you've looked at the Mahdi documentary that I have posted, you'll also notice a discussion of the Taiping Rebellion, even there, and some players within the British Empire. So I'm kind of hoping that you're not just looking at this always as like one section, one section, one section, but if it'd be nice if you could see some of the links of all these histories that we've been talking about. Not easy, especially if you're just being exposed to all of it. I understand that. So. But that's just the goal, or what we'd like to see happen. All right, so we're talking about new connections and challenges to sub-Saharan Africa. Actually, in part, it's not just sub-Saharan Africa. That's a little bit of a misnomer on my lectures here. Sub-Saharan would be basically like the south of the Saharan desert, Africa. And I guess just to kind of remind you, especially in the section, Africa is this huge continent, right? And the north and the east in particular are heavily dominated by Arab and Islamic culture. So not just Islamic, but Arab culture. And something that we kind of address within this chapter, or within this history, is that it's not just Western contact with Africa, but other cultures have had contact with Africa that have influenced it and created a multicultural set of identities. So let's think about the difference, the way that, let's say, that the Zulus developed than the Egyptians. Let's talk, or the Nubians. Let's think about Greek influence coming in. The first translation of the Bible was an African translation. The Greek Septuagint made in Alexandria, Egypt, right, in Africa. You don't really think about that a lot of times. And even some of the earlier important religious thinkers coming out of Catholicism were actually African. We'll talk a little bit more about that later. But what does it mean to be African in terms of how we think about Africa? I hope you're seeing it's much more complex. Okay, so the next slide should be coming. Okay, all right. Of course, I had all these videos put on my lectures that are no longer showing up. If you just get the opportunity, take a look at Lupe Fiasco Conflict Diamonds. Just cut and paste that, or write that into YouTube, and you kind of just look at the way this is a rapper. Lupe Fiasco, looking at Conflict Diamonds, the movie, talking about the way that diamonds afflicts, or the way that it really affects a lot of turmoil within Africa now. Okay, so we're going to see some about the origins of diamonds in Africa. Diamonds have not really been the best friend of Africa. It's made some Africans extremely wealthy and foreigners. But on the other hand, it's kind of has a much more dark and grim legacy than the sparkles that we see when a nicely packaged diamond comes to us, unfortunately. So, the banning of the slave trade, and this is interesting. From the 16th to 18th centuries, Atlantic slave trade ravaged Africa. We know about that. We've talked about it. Many of you are aware of that. We do come from a country that is a slave country, that only relatively recent to history actually no longer has black slaves. By the 1800s, international, there was a big anti-slavery movement in the world. And I kind of want to point this out. It says here, industrialists became more interested in African raw materials, not slaves. I want to reflect upon that for a second. Some people found slavery morally repugnant, that it was unethical. And even many of the people who thought it wasn't ethical didn't necessarily think that black Africans were equal. They simply saw it as inhumane treatment of a life form. That's kind of like really where it's at. Then, on the other hand, you started having wealthy, powerful people who were exploitive simply see slavery as not the best advantage to getting what they wanted. And I encourage any of you, there's a book called Defending Slavery that I use for my American history class. And it shows that Southerners defending slavery basically saying, look, you industrialists are just as exploitative and maybe even worse to your people than we slave owners, because at least we provide food and housing. So it's kind of interesting to see how that all kind of, different ways that this can be looked at. At the end of the day, the slave trade is outlawed in Denmark, 1803, Great Britain, 1807, the USA in 1808. Not slavery, slave trade. Okay, and it was soon followed by Sweden and France. Okay, so again, the actual act of commerce of slavery started getting banned. You still had places like America, obviously, still had slaves. And we have, just to briefly go over, there's certain characters you may or may not have become familiar with. Aluda Aquino. Actually, I probably just said his name wrong. I'm actually not as familiar with him as I would like to be honest. He didn't get brought up much, even in all the college that I had. He really didn't get brought up a lot. But he was like Booker T. Washington, Du Bois, Frederick Douglass. We talked about. You had an African man that was able to articulate himself, and this would just shock Europeans. Why? They had this idea that these were a lower form of humanity, if even humans. So when you had a black person of African descent articulating themselves through writing and speeches, this was like, whoa, like, this is killing our limited perspective on these human beings over here. Oh, they're even humans. This is kind of just kind of what I wanted to bring out. So I'm going to stop it there. Actually, I'm going to come back to this. So I will then move on to some of the other aspects of Africa and commercial trade and so forth in the next set of lectures.